representing Canada's financial capital, the fourth largest city in North America, and the most amazing city in the world. This is Toronto Business Journal.
Hello everyone, we're here for another fabulous edition of Toronto Business Journal. We have an amazing guest today, Mr. Jeff Edmonds, to share his insights on the changing and evolving state of international relations versus in terms of the United States, and his insights on how Canadians should adjust to those relations accordingly. Mr. Jeff Edmonds is an expert on U.S. national security, having covered numerous geographical regions and their implications for U.S. security interests. He is most recently served as the Senior Advisor to the Assistant Secretary of Defense for International Security Affairs in the Office of the Secretary of Defense. His portfolio covered Russia and the Ukraine War, Europe, NATO, the Middle East, and Africa. He is a Senior Analyst at CNA and founder of True North Policy, a boutique geopolitical consulting firm. Jeff previously served as the Director for Russia on the National Security Council and Senior Director for Russia during the 2017 presidential transition. Prior to the NSC, Jeff served as a senior military analyst with the Central Intelligence Agency, with portfolios ranging from South Asian insurgencies to Eurasian security issues. He has served in the U.S. Army on both active duty and the reserves for 20 years, with tours in Iraq and Afghanistan. Jeff holds an MPA from Harvard Kennedy School of Government and MA from Boston University in Religious Studies and a BS from United States Military Academy at West Point. Thank you very much, Mr. Edmonds, for joining us today for an edition of Toronto.
Thank you for joining us.
Thank you very much. And we're definitely honored that you could be on the show, because basically what led me to bring you to the show today was that amazing interview that was, I believe, was on CNN, where you talked about the sort of the evolution, a change taking place with respect to the United States from what many would view to be a value-based sort of foreign policy, which is based upon bringing countries together on a democratic systems and a shared value system, and challenging the rest of the world to live up to those democratic values in terms of challenging sort of totalitarian, authoritarian societies, and that we're seeing kind of a shift where newly elected President Trump seems to be focusing his respect on the leader of China and the leader of China and Russia, President Putin, and and everybody else is sort of lesser, and Zelensky is being treated accordingly to being a lesser power. Particularly our reasons for bringing you to the show today is wanted to get your insights on how. Because as we know, there's a crazy trade war going on right now between Canada and the United States. There's been constant threats that Canadians have experienced with respect to calls for the 51st state. Well, U.S. President Trump wanting to make Canada the 51st state. So I wanted to find out very briefly what's your insights and how that sort of shift. How do you think that shift is going to impact how countries like Canada are going to be interpreting how President Trump is going to be engaging with them as far as his revised approach to foreign policy? Like, how should we as Canadians interpret this sort of new foreign policy in terms of the best constructive way to deal with it?
Yeah, so I think you're right, and I agree with the way you characterized foreign policy before the current administration, in that much of it was driven by shared values, right? And that's, a long tried and true theory in international relations, that's one of the reasons countries cooperate. Certainly, the proximity in history and shared values between us, the United States, and Europe is something that has been longstanding, but that has shifted, at least in the current administration. And the Trump administration's foreign policy in many ways aligns closely with how China and Russia view the world. The idea is that you have a couple centers of power around the globe: United States, China, Russia, You could argue for one in Latin America, but they don't really talk about that very much. But the deal is that not all countries are created equal, right? Sovereignty is not absolute. If your country is a smaller country near one of these superpowers, then you're expected to do what those superpowers ask you to do. And that is why, in some ways, if you buy into that from President Trump's perspective, Ukraine is a Russia problem. It's not a U.S. problem. And that's why I think he defers. If to maintain this system that he sees, where you have a couple of guys that are incredibly powerful, that are the head of these centers of power, then you kind of agree, like, you take care of what's in your neighborhood, you leave what's in my neighborhood alone, and we'll all just get along, and the three of us will decide how the world runs. And that's really, to break it down, it's almost as simple as that. And that's why I think you saw such a dramatic shift from the values that drove. I mean, it's values and the threat from Russia that drove our support for Ukraine. And values is a huge part of that. But values don't play into, I think, the current foreign policy of the United States, at least under this administration. And that's why you had such a dramatic shift when it comes to U.S.-Canadian relations or U.S.-Mexican relations, U.S.-European relations, because suddenly those are no longer values-based, and history doesn't matter here, right? It's more about what you can do for the United States and whether or not you are aligning with what President Trump wants you to do. And that's why you see the sudden tariffs or wanting to buy Greenland or what have you, and him pushing back on that. I mean, he offered up, he wanted to buy Greenland, and Denmark pushed back, and he gets upset about that. He gets upset because he thinks that someone like Denmark should just step in line with the superpower in the region. And so that's kind of where we're at now. As far as what countries should do, I guess the big outstanding question is this just a temporary psychotic break for the United States when it comes to foreign policy? Are things going to return back to the way they are, or are you going to have this flip-flopping with each administration each time it changes parties? And days after Trump, are we still going to have a conservative party? I wouldn't even call it Republican anymore. Are we going to have the far right, believing in this international model that really shuns values? And so I don't really have an answer for that yet. It really depends on whether or not the system that has held the United States in its place for so long, whether that system holds true.
Yeah, one of the things I wanted to take us back a bit, Mr. Edmonds, is as far as Canada. I know, just to put some context in what we're talking about, although Americans and Canadians, we both share the same sort of language as far as English. One of the things which was happening when U.S. President Trump was talking about 51st state is that many Canadians thought that was a big joke, including our Prime Minister Trudeau thought it was a big joke, and that is because when Canadians like to read between the lines, so when President Trump says that, they say, he's just joking, he must want something else, whereas Americans, because I grew up in a sort of an American school system, and particularly for a good part of my education, Americans tend to be read on the line and tend to be more blunt. And I kept telling, for example, Santos that, President Trump is not joking. He really wants to make Canada the 51st state. I said, no, he's just joking and stuff like that.
Well, sometimes he does joke, so it's hard to tell with him sometimes.
Sometimes he does joke, but when he's repeating it often, multiple times, I said, well, that's not a joke and stuff like that. So, one of the concerns I have from an international relations standpoint is, growing up in terms of the American school system, American history, is that when the United States was expanding and stuff like that, there was always an effort to, from my experience or my understanding, you can correct me if I'm wrong in terms of your experience, Mr. Edmonds, is redrawing maps, dispute with international boundaries. I know that U.S. President Trump made some esoteric reference to the 1908 Boundary Treaty, which a professor from Ohio State University said it was very minor and stuff like that. So I know that Warren Buffett very recently talked in very broad terms that tariffs is basically an act of war. So in terms of a very sort of generic approach to looking at an effort by a country to redraw maps or to discuss or talk about, disputes with boundaries and stuff like that in the context of American history specifically, and how countries normally, sort of imperialist or whatever expansion, any countries looking at expansion, should we in Canada be more concerned and take it more seriously when President Trump redraw maps and start disputing boundaries? Should we be concerned about that, or is that just a distraction in your view from your international relations experience?
So I do think that in different corners of his mind, Trump believes the things that he says. That being said, I don't think there's any expansionist drive in U.S. foreign policy right now. In fact, it's actually quite the opposite. I mean, I think some of what he's doing just to rile people up. Although in the back of, it wouldn't surprise if Canada just offered itself up as a 51st state. I'm sure he'd take you up on it. Mm-hmm. That being said, I don't think anybody on the right believes that that's something that's actually going to come about. Uh-huh. When you look at these foreign policies from the right, they really, if you're talking historically at a certain fundamental level, they appeal to what has traditionally been an isolation or a vein of isolationism in U.S. foreign policy. It's always been there. It's been stronger at times. That's kind of gone away since the end of World War II. But it still comes back periodically, given our geography. We're surrounded by friendly nations, or at least they were. And so there is this. Maybe we should just stay home and let the world take care of itself. And that kind of appeals to a lot of his base. And so I think that I just think it's highly unlikely if he started to motivate or make moves to either invade Canada or Mexico, I think the whole system on the right would start to break down, because I don't think anybody has any interest in that at all.
Mm-hmm. So in terms of, what is your sort of insight in terms of the rationality of U.S. President Trump wanting to apparently get a resource deal, which was several times more than the U.S. actually invested in the war effort in Ukraine? I'm just sort of wanting to get your insight on that, because I can understand him wanting, President Trump, from a standpoint of pleasing his voters, wanting to recoup the losses or investment, but the idea that he would want to recoup much more than that and almost make a profit. What is your insight on that, in terms of that whole motivation that sort of instigated that sort of, Zelensky saying that, well, I don't want Ukraine to be paying generations for this. I just don't understand why he would think that's a rational approach to this, but I wanted to get your insight on that.
So, I think there are economic deals to be had that are good for both Ukraine and the United States, right? Just in general. I don't think those should be based on like a per quo basis, quid pro quo basis. I don't think that's the right way to go about that. But this deal in particular is kind of bizarre. He did quote the number 500 billion. I think the entire market value for rare earth minerals, which are a subset of critical minerals, but I think that the entire market value across the globe for rare earth minerals several years ago was only 15 billion. That's for all of them. So it doesn't add up logically. It's not clear. There are different views on how much rare earth minerals Ukraine actually has. A lot of the surveys are from the Soviet era with lesser technology. And so those are debated. So it's not clear what those would be at all. But insofar as part of the deal was intended to bring in foreign direct investment, I think that's a good thing. But it shouldn't be based on the idea that Ukraine is paying us back. That's not that. I don't think that's very valid at all. What would benefit us is a Ukraine that in some way maintains its sovereignty and becomes economically more viable. That's just good for everybody, except for us.
Okay. Then
the war as well. Yeah.
What you were going to say, Santosh? Yeah.
Oh no, just end the war going on as well. Like if that could come to a peaceful resolve.
I'm sorry, whether or not the war can come to a peaceful resolve?
Yes, in Ukraine, yeah.
I don't think there's any peaceful or meaningful negotiations to be had while Putin thinks he's winning. He has very clear strategic goals. Things like, one, the current government in Ukraine not being there, Ukraine being aligned at a minimum with no one, but preferably with Russia, Ukraine being demilitarized, all of that being guaranteed by the United States, which would in itself be a fundamental shift in foreign policy. And the Russians are making gains in the East. And as long as he thinks he can achieve what he needs to achieve through military means, there's no reason for him to do anything else. This isn't about territory. right? I think it's an important distinction to make. He doesn't care about the territory. More territory means more money and resources away from the Russian economy. This is about the strategic orientation of Ukraine. He doesn't need to control Belarus, right? Belarus is basically a client state now. He doesn't need to have his own troops there. He doesn't need to pay Social Security there or what have you, the Russian equivalent. And so it's not about controlling the territory. It's about controlling the orientation of the foreign policy of Ukraine. And right now, I don't see any, like, peaceful means, I don't see any lasting peace right now other than Ukraine surrendering. And I don't think that's acceptable.
And we just, just recently, I believe it was today, or maybe been yesterday, President Trump decided to cut off the military aid to Ukraine. So wouldn't that perhaps make the ability of the Russians to accelerate their move in the east and consolidate themselves? And
certainly can. It certainly can. So Ukraine's ability to fight depends on a number of things. U.S. aid is necessary, but not necessarily sufficient. There are things the Ukrainians need to do themselves. And I've said this before, and it's somewhat controversial and not the nicest. It's just depressing, but Ukraine needs to send more people to the front. Right? This is becoming a manpower problem. They've largely solved some of the ammunition problems. Ukraine has somewhat of an advantage in the drone space, but they need more people on the front lines. But that's a debated topic inside Ukraine. That's my view on that. But that makes that situation so much worse when they're not getting U.S. aid, right? And I guess the unknown question is, you're seeing a lot of statements from European leaders right now that Europe can fill a void. That remains to be seen, because it wasn't easy for us to give what we were giving to Ukrainians after a while. People think, we just have all of this stuff waiting in warehouses that we just ship them. But when it comes to the high-end systems, like the air defense systems and the long-range strike systems, those things are precious and few, right? And they're hard to make, and they take a long time to make. And so it's not clear that Europe can fill the void there. I'm not saying they can't, but they're going to have to dig pretty deep in order to make up for the lack of U.S. support, if that continues.
And one last question I have with you, Mr. Edmonds, is I've sort of noticed that that U.S. President Trump has been having very much a rash of executive orders, and even though the Congress is controlled of Republicans, there seems to be President Trump seems to be focusing on executive decisions as opposed to consulting his own Republican and congressional representatives as far as foreign policy, as far as domestic policy in general. So I was just wondering whether, from a standpoint of Canadians and other people in the world, should we be concerned about this sort of what some Americans have deemed to be a sort of an authoritarian leaning in Trump, and to what extent that authoritarian leaning is complementing his foreign policy, which seems to be very much respectful of what we talked about to start, this sort of military power focused and just foreign policy. Should we be concerned about that, or do you think it's just a?
I think you and we should be concerned about some of the trends we're seeing. So I think there's a personal preference here for him to just execute what he wants to do, and again, in line with his foreign policy, everybody just needs to get in line, right? So even though he has control of the Congress and the Senate, it doesn't stop him from just wanting to do things himself. And there's also, you get the sense here in D.C. that people like Elon Musk and others are just trying to move fast enough to cause enough chaos that it's hard to stop them from doing what they're doing. That being said, a lot of there is some hope in the sense that a lot of the systems, the legislative systems, and the judicial systems have kind of kicked in at certain points when they really needed to, when something dramatic was happening. That didn't stop damage from being done. But again, our system the system's being tested, right? And we'll see how it comes out on the other side. But it is disturbing, some of the power plays and some of the movements we've seen coming out of the White House when it comes to really wanting as much power as possible and as few checks as possible is pretty disturbing.
So do you have any sort of words of wisdom or insight you might want to share that you haven't had an opportunity of sharing before, whether it's respect to, United States foreign policy or Canada or any sort of issues that you think we should be paying more attention to as people in the world, or or Americans specifically?
So I think it depends on parts of the world. I mean, part of that is so let's take Europe and NATO, for example. Both sides of the aisle in the United States have called for NATO countries to commit more and to build up their industrial base. I think that's perfectly sound criticism, and it comes from both Democrats and Republicans. So my words of wisdom, given the ebb and flow of U.S. aid to Europe, would be that those countries do need to step up and be able to defend themselves. I think that's just a prudent move on their part. I think that's prudent for Canada and Mexico. I mean, I would say avoid overreactions and to try to be prudent, and I would say try to take a higher ground. But at the same time, clearly, there's this. It's not a rule, but maybe a inclination for strong men to listen to other strong people. And so I certainly don't think that cowering or giving in necessarily or sorry, that's my puppy.
No problem.
I certainly don't think that sacrificing too much for the sake of appeasing Trump is a good idea. I think that countries should stand for what they need to, and if we're not, if this values-based order is being questioned by people here in the United States, it's that much more important for other countries to uphold it.
So yes, just one little supplementary comment before we end. That there's some have argued that definitely an assertive approach to U.S. President Trump is one that he's more likely to respect than one that's just wants to, an approach that just seems to acquiesce and defer to him and stuff like that. So I guess that's that would. It
doesn't always work. I mean, it didn't work with President Zelensky. It's a fair criticism of what I'm saying, but again, it depends on where the country is located in certain sense, and it depends on the status of the country in Trump's mind, right?
Oh, I see. Okay.
So I think that Canada has more room to do that than perhaps Zelensky does, and that's not a fair thing to say. That's just a very pragmatic. If I was a betting man, I would say that that's what I would say. Not that it's proper, but I just think that Canada and Mexico need to stand strong. I mean, with the hopes that this passes and we can return to the kind of neighborly relationships we had before this.
Awesome. So thank you very much, Mr. Edmonds, for taking the time to share your very thoughtful, learned views with us. We're grateful that you took the time to share your views, and everybody in Canada wishes you well, and will continue to track you. Do you have a website that is True North Policy that people can consult?
Yeah, I know it doesn't get news updates per se. I have that, and I have at Jeff A. Edmonds on Twitter, which I update every now and then, LinkedIn, stuff like that.
Awesome. So if you could share us any link after the show, and we'll make sure we'll put that with the interview below for people to keep track of your very insightful comments. So thank you much again, Mr. Edmonds, for coming to the show.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you.
Thank you, sir.